Of the many points we've made over the years regarding the question of methodology in relation to the Quran, from understanding every word by observing how it's used exclusively within the limits of the book, to the notion of number as basically a notation system for different and unique modes of experience, to gender as a relation that starts off in the mind, as a process of producing ideas, thoughts, and language, and of being immediately aware of the fact, i.e. of our productivity or agency. In this segment, we want to elaborate upon the concept of experience, as we see that the clarity of everything that we've said so far hinges on the clarity of this concept. Two key intellectual personalities come to mind here, Martin Heidegger and Henri Bergson, whose examination of this idea, which on the surface does not seem to warrant much thought, let alone thousands of pages of hair-splitting expositions, led them to collectively emphasize and, ironically some might say, dogmatize the notion of life, Leben, in opposition to the stringently logical and rather technical approaches of science. Where the scientific tendency is highly instrumental, relying mostly on data and relations between classes and classifications, experiments and statistics, life observes the subject who's engaged in the experience, i.e. the scientist who, occupied with the object with all its painstaking details, has subsequently completely lost himself in it, to whom no serious distinction exists between his own mode of experience and the facts which his object disclose to him. His aim, as Jung put it in describing what we believe is the psychological temperament that dominates the sphere of science, is always to influence his environment, to unite it with himself, or annex himself to it. In contrast to the opposite temperament which likes to preserve a certain distance and independence and, if you will, integrity of the subject from his environment. Throughout his work, Heidegger stresses the distinction between the scientific and phenomenological experience, emphasizing the importance of understanding the world not just through scientific analysis, but also through our lived phenomenological experience. There's a difference, he suggests, between merely seeing an object as a scientific entity, a collection of physical properties, and understanding it in terms of its use or purpose in the context of human activity. Elaborating through the famous analogy of the hammer, which he uses to distinguish between the concepts of readiness at hand and presence at hand, that, when we are simply using it to hammer a nail, we don't focus on its physical properties or scientific aspects. Instead, our experience is practical and contextual. A tool is what it is when it's in my hand, not the ensemble of material designed and framed in a certain way. I know what a hammer is when I'm using it or I'm seeing it being used. Not when I read a handbook detailing how a hammer is a tool that has a handle that weighs a certain number of ounces, whose head is made of that material, that has a claw that's shaped like this. No, none of this has any meaning until we've seen a hammer in action. When we've held it, when we've used it. In the same manner is the concept of life as an intellectual mode of experience distinguished from the scientific. Kant demonstrates this with an example from arithmetic. Why should 7 plus 5 equal 12? 7 plus 5, he says, shows nothing beyond the union of two numbers into one, whereby nothing's being thought as to what the single number may be which combines them. We by no means arrive at a concept of 12 by thinking of the union of 7 and 5. We may analyze our concept of this sum till kingdom come and not find anything in the combination of 5 and 7 that says 12. We do, however, obtain 12, Kant says, when we enumerate. That is, when, starting with the number 7 and
calling in the aid of the fingers of my hand as intuition in order to form with it the concept of 5, I gradually add to the number 7 the units which I previously took together to make up 5. And by means of the image of my hand, I thus see the number 12 arise. That 5 should be added to 7, this I had no doubt already thought of in the concept of sum 7 5, but not that this sum be equal to the number 12.
In other words, what Kant's saying is that we obtain sums of things from the experience of counting, by crossing that distance separating two things, by an act of assembly, by counting 5 from 7 or 7 from 5. Such an approach is a way different from that which simply calculates mechanically, whereby the functions of mathematics are treated as no more than rules of addition, and the numbers, which by their mere conjunction give us other numbers. On the other hand, there's Leibniz, who, in the monadology, makes the same distinction as Kant, Bergson, and Heidegger, only with the mill as his analogy of choice. Supposing that there were a machine whose structure produced thought, sensation, and perception, i.e. an object of experience, he writes, we can conceive of it as increased in size with the same proportions until one is able to enter into its interior, as he would into a mill. Now on going into it, we would find only pieces working upon one another, but never would we find anything to explain perception, inasmuch as in Kant's analogy, we find nothing in the combination of 7 plus 5 that explains 12, as their sum. We see the modules or parts of the mill pushing one another, but we don't have a concept of what we're seeing until we've seen the product which these various modules are employed to produce. Thus the result which a certain process leads to an extent, is the mark of the experience, a positive interruption which we routinely encounter in the experience. Thus think of perception as the completeness of a certain experience, or relative completeness if we consider that any given experience consists of parts or details, in which every detail is an experience in of itself, that it has the same structure as logic and forms, a premise and a conclusion, and the relation between them of implication and presupposition. It's rather a certain experience of actually understanding, like Heidegger's hammer, the machinery of the mill, through the observation of its functions. The same way 12 is obtained by counting 5 from 7 or 7 from 5. This gives us perception, i.e. understanding the experience or machinery to the extent that the name assigned to the experience allows. So if the experience is called the mill, which in Latin means to grind, then perception covers that very process. That would be, for the mill, in the Aristotelian phrase, its nature, its telos. In other words, we have an experience when we've actually beheld the very mechanisms which form the idea of the mill, by seeing how it grinds, crushes, and cuts solid masses into smaller pieces. It's also called an experience because in it, the elements are not the object of our experience, but that which they are instrumental to. The modules are therefore expedient and merely guide us, frame by frame, towards that conclusion which we then call the mill, or moleri. We see that the Latin sense of the term replaces all the mechanical details with an infinitive, to grind, recognizing that the proper limit of the experience is the transformation which the grinding content undergoes. This is a mode of experience which we all share, and inform our common idea of objectivity. However, the scientist's vision differs from this only to the extent that he's able to see diminutions of this overall process, i.e. the mechanisms of grinding, the levels of pressure to which a given mass must be subjected, mechanical operations, the rotation of the ball and rods which do the grinding, the function of the mill liners, the mill shell, the movement of the grinding media, the discharge system, the speed at which the grinding modules must operate in order to produce the desired effect, and other highly technical details which the scientist, as opposed to the average person, must have access to. In other words, the scientist would have a more nuanced mode of experience, pertaining to the technical schema by which the simple experience of seeing the mill in action is performed. Now, the concept of experience in the Quran is not different from the above examples. This will show as we delve into specific concepts such as verse 11 of chapter 18 provides, the account of the young men of the cave. Now the word ears is translated from the Arabic udun, which is indeed used in multiple occasions to mean ears or ear. But there's more to it that is quite relevant for the task of showing how the Quran masterfully captures the concept of experience. The word udun, ears, we find it used on other occasions to mean permission, bi'idhnillah, or as in verse 279 of chapter 2, where God says, in regards to the prohibition of usury, that should it continue to be practiced after the warning had been issued, that the people should
take notice of a war by God and His Messenger.
And in addition to the oft-repeated phrase, bi'idhnillah, with the permission of the Lord, it's also used as a call for prayer, adhana. Now, how can a single word have all these different meanings? There must be a relation, however preposterous it may sound, between the bodily organ, ear, and the notion of permission and call for prayer. And in order to justify the difference, The term can no more be exclusive to the sphere of biology, as with the ear, than to the mental, but the word must be general enough as to apply with equal validity in both spheres. If we examine the ear's function, we find something to it of permissiveness. Namely, we don't control what the ear picks up. It picks up any and all sounds of any pitch which it is designed to pick up, inasmuch as eyes perceive anything that falls within sight. But unlike sight, significantly less volition is allotted to the ears. We cannot choose the pitch which we want our ears to pick up, and which to ignore like we can control what to look at and what not to. The degree of control assigned to the ear is virtually nil, and it's from this place, this consenting function, that flows the metaphorical import of the ear, that allows it to be meaningful in all these other contexts. The more general sense of any term rationalizes the more specific. This analytical function is what allows us to escape the problem of literalism without falling into concordism. There's a scheme which springs forth from the physical ear, as its logical foci, outward, i.e. beyond the physical sphere, to the metaphysical, where the basic organic function of sonic reception spills into more complex contexts and is thereby transformed, yet maintaining that original generic rule of reception or receptivity. The difference between the organic, or physical, and metaphysical spheres of the function is that in the latter, ear acquires modality, i.e. becomes an object of literary conceit and metaphorical extension. For example, the use of tree as a running theme in a story, or a sentence. For example, in the following sentence,
Although the roots of our relation are shallow, the fruits it bore had been abundant.
we see that tree here, when used metaphorically, has as much import and significance as the actual physical tree. In fact, there are processes or ideas that are communicable only by means of the properties of the tree, like genealogical relations. Thus, in the context of war, as in verse 279, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ, take note of a war, when understood in this new sense, the above definition of ear removes the notice attached to it, now expressing one's utter susceptibility and defenselessness in the face of a sudden war effort. It's not that their action, their transgression, their defiance of God's decree would have permitted a war to be waged upon them. It's that their action is specifically a war act, casus belli, that must be responded to in kind, that's not different from an ambush or a preemptive strike. Usury, riba, we're told in this context, had been marshaled, which means that there is no ambiguity as to the kind of response which any instance of usury should provoke. Much like how water, if poured into an oval-shaped container, takes exactly that form. Udun, as a literary device, makes the container and substance formally subject and adapted to one another. In the other context, with the permission of God, bi'idhnillah, concedes that the action had already merited God's approval, that the action already aligns with and is therefore corroborated by God. In verse 119 of chapter 5, it's used in association with the word al-an'am, meaning benefits or goods, in a context in which the devil promises to block or prevent them, meaning that to the extent that the good is a formal condition or a prerogative, he aims to preclude it, to make it an exception, to nullify it as a possibility. In the context of prayer, the relation is more direct. Here, consent is being drawn, or the permissive state is being exploited to communicate a message. Thus, when someone yells a phrase in the middle of a quiet room full of people, they're taking advantage of the fact that they will be heard, that everyone there is already susceptible or sensitive to the noise. Udun treats this condition of susceptibility not as a null state, but as a condition, an active state, valid in itself, because here, one thing can only affect another if that other is formally subject or open to the effect. Thus the condition is inapplicable if everyone in the room had been deaf. Take as an approximate example this passage by Samuel Alexander.
The immanent causality of an organism is sustained by the environment. Nervous action is affected immanently by nutrition, but nutrition is an effect of external substances. And nervous action contains essentially motor response to the surroundings.
Observe how your body reacts to a ball being thrown at you in a game. You'll find that your response to catching the ball is but a series of adjustments to the motion of the ball. Your body responds dynamically to the ball's trajectory, and according as the ball's motion is affected by the wind, so that it's harder to predict, or steady, fast or slow. Each instance, being uniquely different from the last, elicits the response appropriate to it. This is an extension to the Heideggerian Readiness-at-hand with the hammer, which is a mode included under equipment. The mode of experience involved here approximates that which the concept of udhun carries, our almost formal adaptability to certain stimuli, that the color red, for instance, should turn orange when mixed with yellow, or that an ice cube should melt under a certain temperature, are great examples of it. You'll note here that udhun applies no longer just to the ear and sound, though it's where it has its proper seat, but to anything which shares to anything else the same relation which the ear shares with sound. But add to this a very important detail. Udhun applies to things as perfectly adapted to certain effects or changes, but only if this adaptation and changeability leads to change and actual effects. Thus, mere adaptability is not enough. Rather, we say that being adapted, an object must permit to be affected or changed. In other words, add to the formal condition of adaptability or possibility of change the temporal act of change and adaptation, as it's here where the relation is consummated and can be summed up as such. The purpose of the example of the ball is to show the relation between experience as it is and adaptability thereto, that we are adapted to things to the extent that they are able to affect us, that things can only affect other things if they are effective, and can be affected if they are liable to affection, like my response to the ball by adjusting my body in a certain way. These physiological modifications are so natural, so automatic, that we need a word stronger than adaptation, than modification, than adjustment to give justice to it. As in all these terms, the sense of volition and direct control and mastery contained in them betray, if even a little, that sense of tact, fluency, symbiosis, which we generally ascribe to the way in which we react to things. Everywhere nature dominates this mode of experience. We pompously call an idea false, ridiculous, or outrageous, but take for granted the process of how so complex an idea, however ridiculous it's judged to be, is even framed in our mind. That we were exposed to the falsehood or outrage in the first place connotes the fact of our adaptability to falsehood or outrage. What we dispute over is the implications which said idea has, not its self-evidence, yet that the idea occurred to me in the first place, that my mind is so designed as to automatically sense, analyze, and compose the idea as a mental object and present it to me in the form of a simple, seemingly accidental impression is somehow of no interest, though it is the part that makes all the difference. Another word that demonstrates the notion of pure experience is the Arabic word for visit, zurtum, or ziyara, which we find used in multiple contexts. Grave visiting, in verse 2 of chapter 102, where it's said how reproduction and increase in number apparently gave rise to the custom of grave visiting. In another context, it's used to mean falsehood or lies, as in verse 30 of chapter 22. And lastly, in chapter 18, with the cave-goers, and the relation between them and the outside world, from which they were insulated throughout their stay. Again, we must ask, how can this word have all these different meanings though it's one and the same word? How can to visit also mean falsehood in a different context? Something's not right. The solution, as shown above with the concept of ear, is to take a higher or more general standpoint, a version of zur or ziyada that's general enough as to apply non-contradictorily in all these different contexts, regardless of their complexity. The answer to this, as we've seen, is by seeing what these three different contexts have in common. In visiting a grave, as in the utterance of falsehood, there is a unifying mode of experience, a mode which can be summed up in the word simulacrum. For example, in grave visiting, you don't meet the deceased. That is, we don't have direct access to the body, therefore it is not a proper meeting. Just as a falsehood is similar to truth. It might at first seem safer to take ziyara, or zur, in the original sense of visiting. That way it doesn't matter if the meeting is face-to-face or not, i.e. whether we're visiting someone's grave or just visiting someone. But that does not explain why the word occurs in the context of falsehood. Thus, general though the term visiting is, as applies in contexts involving meeting, it's not general enough as to apply in contexts that do not involve meeting, as in verse 30 of chapter 22. Let's turn for a moment to verse 17 of chapter 18. Two problems arise here. Firstly, the term tazawar here is not referring to the sun, but rather to people who'd either bypassed or entered the cave at some point. Tazawaru is the verb action of whomever the epithets that al-yamin and that al-shimal are describing. This construction form is familiar to us from chapter 89, verse 7, al-Fajr, the dawn, where God describes the city of Iram, the capital of the people of Ad, which he calls That al-Imad, translated as of the great stature or of the imposing edifice. The second problem is that of the applicability of the term visitation. Visiting is not an accurate term. It makes the act, so described, intentional or planned. Is it the place that one visits or the people who occupy it? You don't visit the grave, but the person buried in it. The condition of occupancy is therefore provisory. But being that no one could have known that the cavegoers had been in there, it mustn't be them who are being visited, as this assumes that their whereabouts had been known. Add to this the fact that the phenomenon of supposedly being visited was a daily occurrence, from sunrise to sunset, and this never ceased to happen during their slumber. If they had been occupying the place the whole time, and ziyara or visitation necessitates the condition of occupancy, then the term in that particular context could not mean visitation or visiting in the common sense of the term. We need a term that has that sense of visiting, but more general, specifically one that does not include intention or foreknowledge of occupancy, or relation to the occupant. This term would be in the neighborhood of coincidence or, better yet, synchronicity. The concept of synchronicity specifically applies and describes how two things, seemingly or simply unrelated, occupy the same time and place. The form of this relation is acausal, i.e. not governed or operating by laws of cause and effect, but merely describes the coexistence of two things which have nothing to do with one another. Take the following example. On your way to work, you frequently bypass a certain building which you later find out used to be the home of Charlie Chaplin. Now, if in a conversation you wish to describe your relation to Charlie Chaplin in that context, you might want to use a term that accurately describes how you've been frequently bypassing Charlie Chaplin's house without knowing it. A term that accounts for the fact that it's not intentional, not contemporaneous, i.e., Chaplin need not be alive, but relates you somehow, someway to the English actor. This term in the Quran is tazawar, or zurtum. This new sense of the term is general enough as to apply to each context in which it occurs in the Quran with no contradiction. The dilemma, which we come upon in verse 17 of chapter 18, can finally be resolved by saying that the young men's cave had been the site of numerous passerbys, yet none of these passers had known that the cave had been occupied, much less by these young men, these vagabonds. In the context of chapter 102, of visiting the graves, it means that of the sheer increase in human population, it became customary or commonplace to be in or around an area in which someone's buried and not be aware of the fact, like driving by a graveyard and not noticing it, or passing by an area that has what looks like small hills or knolls, and later being told that these are Anglo-Saxon burial mounds, as had been my experience at one point. Now, the same general sense is transferable to the context of falsehood, which we can say means to insinuate, being that in insinuation, what's intended is not what's being said, or that the implication goes beyond what's being said, and it's usually the implication or connotation that's intended. You might wonder, what something as intentional as zur have to do with something as unintentional as synchronicity? And we answer that synchronicity is intentional when applied, and unintentional when not, i.e., my relation to Chaplin, for instance, although purely coincidental, is no longer the case when the connection is made. Thus in zur, we're conducting the former act, intentionally building a causal connection with an originally acausal relation, or making a link where no link formally exists. Yamin and shimal commonly translate into right and left. However, as with the concepts of visitation and ears, their true modal meaning is a far cry from what their translations say.
And what is that in your right hand, O Moses?
And once more in his standoff with the magicians, when he asks them to cast his staff so that it may turn into a snake. In another very frequent context, there occurs the concept of ma malakat aymanukum, or that which your right hand possesses. Also, we read that, on the day of judgment, those who are handed their book in their right hand enter paradise. Now, what's the significance of this right hand? In analyzing this concept, we must go beyond the sphere of the body, as we did with the ears. The right hand is to be interpreted as that which
is capable of indefinite extension. We feel the ground at the end of the stick we carry, not at the finger which holds the stick. The stick has become part of our body. So may anything in contact with our bodies, like our dress, injury, or offense to which we resent as we do offenses to our body. My body may include things not in contact with me, or indeed any of the external objects I am interested in. My room, my books, my friends, and all the things I care about, philosophy or psychology, which are systems of knowledge, the works of Plato, the history of my country. All these things may become extensions of my body, and the experiences I get from them may be for a time of a class with my organic and other bodily sensations.
Think of phrases like my company, my car, my people. Those are things which I speak of as possessions, as things belonging to me, though they are not things which I hold or can hold in my hand except metaphorically. Yet, I treat them as though they are objects which I hold in my hand. The reason why when tapping the ground with a stick, we feel the stick and not the hand, is because, in some sense, we've become one with the object. When God asks Moses what he's holding in his right hand, he's inquiring into the broader sense and use of the stick and its equipment, emphasizing the possessive nature of the relation. That the stick, to Moses, is not just a possession, but also something which he commands, a capacity or power of some sort, more than it is a stick. Thus, when we speak of Moses' staff, we always do so as a mosaic trait. Heidegger uses the term equipment to describe this relation. When tools are functioning smoothly in our activities, we don't explicitly notice them. They become an extension of ourselves. The hammer in my grip is not the feeling of my hand. Rather, the authority of my hand has flowed into the instrument, and the instrument has accordingly become a part of me. Even the expression hand, yed, in the Quran extends beyond a physical nexus. It's used synonymously with authority or control, which is quite relevant in relation to yamin. The Quran uses yed as the nexus of control, which when involved in an instrumental relation, evolves into the expression yamin. We read in this verse that certain subscribers to Judaism asserted that God's hands are tight-fisted, suggesting that he's parsimonious. Yed is to be understood here as that by means of which a resource is handled, or that which commands resources. Thus, in relation to possessions, the stick, the company, the car, Yed points to that which handles them. God uses this word as an epithet to describe Prophet David, calling him Dhul Aidi. What's described here is not his resources, his possessions, which span his armies, money, estates, etc., i.e. mulk, but his handling of them, pointing to things like competence, conscientiousness, aptitude, power, expertise, etc. Yamin is the vehicle that links Yed to that by which to perform these aptitudes or qualities, i.e. to be powerful and competent, you need a means of demonstrating or applying power and competence. It does not point directly to possessions or resources, as that's mulk, but to a certain prehensiveness or extensity of extending oneself into things outside of oneself, either outside one's body or whatever one happens to be in possession of, as possession is to be treated as an extension of oneself as much as one's body is. Thus we see something of a logical connection between the three concepts of mulk, yad, and yamin that runs
1. Yad covers and pertains to aptitudes, skill, power, control, and command. 2. Mulk covers and pertains to possessions, what one owns. 3. Yamin is the prehensive activity which extends from yad over to things that do not yet constitute one's mulk, so as to make them so, or to the act of directing, exercising, or handling one's resources and possessions.
As to shimal, we're directed to the opposite of yamin. Here we reverse the rule. The triadic relation does not change, but no extension from yed over into mulk, possessions, is taking place. Thus shimal is the negative condition or potential, not yet performed of course, of prehension. This can either have a negative connotation of stagnation or a positive one of potential and prospect. Thus the main condition of yed is not cancelled, rather the capacities and aptitudes by which the act of prehension or seizure is performed find no occasion for application, therefore remaining in a state of potential. Thus the devil says,
I will approach them from their front, their back, their right, their left, and then you will find most of them ungrateful. 7:17.
Implying here that he will target those areas that pertain to potential or prospect. Essentially, he aims to incapacitate or disempower, to sever that link which connects yed to mulk, or aptitude, to possession, and therefore nullifying that function of prehension or seizure. That the opposite of any term is a negative condition of whatever the positive term is an idea whose confirmation we find to apply in all terms of opposition in the Quran. The opposite of a positive term is not the reverse situation, but the possibility to perform or represent the positive, or as Kant aptly put it, the condition for the possibility of a concept is the definition of it. Thus shimal becomes the definition of yamin, and on this basis, all negative concepts become the possibility for their positive equivalents, or let's say they evince or give reality to them. This is because concepts are here approached teleologically. Just like nature is teleological, so are the ideal framework that ground the concepts of nature, which in turn span all that which belongs to nature, human beings included.